first and foremost, we have been anticipating the firing of Jeff Scott. I know there was sort of a little bit of a should they do it, should they not do it, but ultimately, in your opinion, what ended up being the deciding factor between Michael Kelly saying, this is our guy versus we can't do this anymore.
Well, this is pretty obvious, but the deciding factor was the 26-point loss to Temple the other night. That dropped him to 4-26 overall. Only one win against a Division I or a FBS team in his 2+ seasons. And it kind of made it hard to sell any sort of progress at that point, where his only win against an FBS team was last year against Temple. This year, that Temple team has a new coaching staff, and then they go and lose on the road 54-28. At that point, it became really hard to see a path forward where you couldn't sell recruiting stuff, you couldn't sell on-field progress. There was no positive that you could sell. And that was unfortunate for the Bulls because I don't think they wanted to make a coaching change. I know they didn't want to because Jeff Scott did everything else right. I mean, his players were out of trouble. He brought in, kind of upgraded the talent, upgraded the culture a lot, was a fundraising partner to get facilities back to where really USF needs to be. The only problem, which is a major one, was the scoreboard. And the 26-point loss to Temple just kind of made it clear that there's no coming back for that.
What is going to be the biggest ticket for this administration to try to lure in someone? And what is the realistic options for these fans to think about?
Yeah, well, let's start with the realistic options to think about. I suppose we live in a scenario where Jon Gruden could get the job. I would be extremely, extremely, extremely surprised. Deion Sanders is a name that I have been hearing for quite some time from USF fans. I would be very surprised. I think Coach Prime will land a Power 5 job if he wants it this cycle. So then you kind of go into the next tier. And to me, you've got a couple different options. Do you go kind of the hot young assistant, like a Jawan Sider, the running backs coach at Penn State? Do you go maybe like a Willie Simmons, who's a head coach at Florida A&M and has done a really nice job there? Or do you get somebody who's maybe more established but has been through a rough spell, a kind of retread, like a Dan Mullen, who was at Florida, Justin Fuente, who was at Virginia Tech and Memphis. Tom Herman is somebody whose names come up, who was at Texas and Houston. So it kind of depends on what scenario you think USF wants. How important is that head coaching experience? And really, how important is the sizzle and the kind of wow factor? Because to me, what makes this job so interesting right now is there's a lot going for it at USF. This is still one of the most fertile recruiting, top 4 recruiting states in the country in the state of Florida. Tampa is one of the best markets in the country to recruit. So there's plenty of talent. The transfer portal makes it even easier to get that with the guys you missed the second time around. The facilities are getting better with the indoor practice facility opening soon. The push for an on-campus stadium just hasn't quite all come together. And I think USF probably, in a perfect world, would have a splash hire, a big name that can get the Tampa Bay community excited about USF football. And I mean, let's face it, they're in a market with the Bucks, the Rays, and Lightning, and the Gators, I would argue, are of general, more local interest. So at best, they're probably fifth fiddle, and that makes it really hard. So maybe you really, really need a big name to kind of make a splash to get people talking about the Bulls.
Yeah, and with Gruden, even if there was a mutual interest there, is that even something that's going to be feasible with the public outcry, which is going to follow, maybe not locally here in Tampa, because I think there still is a large Gruden fan base of people that like him, but that all of a sudden USF is going to be the national story if this happens, and what the ripple effect is in that situation.
Yeah. First of all, again, to repeat, I do not envision that scenario happening. But if we play the hypothetical game with Gruden, is he really going to coach in a stadium, at Raymond James Stadium, that took his name off the Ring of Honor? USF is going to go for that. I have a very hard time imagining that. And yes, there would certainly be backlash because of the emails he sent with the Raiders. But let's just kind of look at this from a football perspective for a second. He was the last time he was a college coach was 1991 at Tennessee. The game has changed so much since then, where obviously none of the players he would be coaching would have been born, and we're going years before that. The game has changed so much with NIL and the transfer portal just in the last couple of years. So the idea that Gruden would come in with no experience at this level and a generation and lead a program that needs somebody who can deliver wins, I have a very hard time believing that scenario.
Would USF be willing to potentially overpay maybe for a head coach and whatever their budget allows to possibly get a big name. And the reason why I asked that is because you would have to imagine with the conference realignment and that constantly in flux, which I'm assuming is a big reason why they need this on-campus stadium to prove to conferences, hey, we are making the necessary upgrades to bring us along for the ride. Does that allow them, or do you think that's in the realm of possibility for them to land a splash name with the hopes that that can be their selling point to a potential conference to say, bring us in, look at all these shiny new objects we got?
Yeah, I would certainly think they would love to have the money for that. I don't know what their budget is going to be at this point. I know Jeff Scott was one of the highest paid coaches in the AAC, but you compare the 2.4, 2.5 million he was making to what coaches are getting in the Big Ten and the SEC and the ACC, and I mean that's a really nice coordinator salary. So there's a huge gulf in the middle there. But I think your general point, though, is well taken. This is a pivotal time for USF because they are making progress toward that on-campus stadium that they've been talking about since literally before they started building the stadium. And it feels closer now than it ever has been. But to get there, they're going to need to find 200 to 300, 400 million dollars somewhere. Some of that they're gonna borrow, I assume, and some of it will be fundraised. But somehow they're going to have to make that work. And a big name would certainly help with that because, as you said, the conference realignment is a very real thing. UCF here in 8 months is going to be going to the Big 12, and nobody knows what the future is going to hold with the major conferences. Is it going to be 2? Is it going to be 4? Is it going to be 5, 6? One giant one? Nobody has any idea. But USF needs to do the right things to position themselves for whatever this next version of college football is going to look like. And having the stadium and the facilities, that's part of it. But so is, just as important or more important, having success on the field that will get people excited, not just in Tampa, but Topeka and Tulsa and everywhere else in the country, so that they will want to pay attention to USF football.
And then finally, just to put a bow on sort of the Jeff Scott era, how would you maybe sum up what went wrong and what his lasting legacy would be? And you kind of touched on it in the beginning, but I think a lot of people were genuinely excited about the hire when it happened and are also as equally surprised about how it blew up in his face on the field.
Yeah, he had everything that you would have wanted for a coach of this caliber to have, right? He was one of the top assistants in the country, a rising star. He had that Clemson DNA where he won a couple of national championships. He recruited the heck out of Florida when he was at Clemson. It all seemed to make sense. And again, he did everything right in terms of being a fundraising partner, is what athletic director Michael Kelly called him, and getting more out, USF into community more. He did all of that stuff right. It was just on the field. And, if you watched any of the games, it was, I honestly think he was kind of in over his head. And I hate to put it that bluntly, but that's the easiest explanation, where they looked unprepared to start games, which is why they were one of the worst first half teams in the country last year and just as bad this year. They didn't make the adjustments. The talent was, I think, 65th in the country, according to the 247 composite, but the actual performance on the field was somewhere between like 105th and 115th. So obviously the talent was better than what the results were. And at the end of the day, that's coaching. That's the development. That's putting players in position to make plays. And he didn't do that enough, and his staff didn't do that enough. And that's why he had a 4-26 tenure that was, not arguably, statistically the worst of any major Florida coach who was there for at least 2 years.
And then lastly, I don't know if you're there yet, but of the names you gave, is there one or two where you're like, you know what, if I was a USF football fan, I would have a close eye on this person because I really think that the buzz around them is significant enough to such where they could be coming to town?
Well, if Deion Sanders is available, he would be my first call. Again, I don't think he will. I think he's going to shoot for higher than a Group of 5 program, but he would be the first one. He's done a really good job at Jackson State, much better than I expected. He would recruit well. He would bring the sizzle. That would be one. Kind of a little bit lower profile name that I would throw out if this is probably not going to happen, but Tom Allen in Indiana. He started his career coaching high schools in Hillsborough County, spent some time at USF. He's the Indiana head coach right now, but things are not going well. maybe there's a scenario where they need to mutually part ways, and this would be a landing spot for him. But aside from that, I think maybe a Dan Mullen would be interested. And then I guess one more name I throw out is Jason Candle at Toledo. He had did really well his first couple of years, and then they faded. But he's got a team right now that's capable of winning the MAC, and is recruited very well in the Tampa area. Got Deontay Johnson out of Leonard High School several years back, for one example. So those are some of the names that I think would have the potential to do very well at USF.